Three girls walked into a shopping mall in the middle of the day. There were no screams, no witnesses, and no signs of panic. No one ever saw them leave. What followed was not chaos, but silence. A silence so complete that it has endured for decades, resisting time, technology, and countless attempts to explain what should have been impossible. This is not a solved murder, and it is not a story with a clean ending. It is a cold case that has slept for more than half a century in American history, while the central question remains untouched. How could three young girls vanish together in a crowded public space without leaving behind a single reliable trace? The setting is Fort Worth, Texas, during the Christmas season of 1974, when a routine shopping trip quietly became the last moment anyone could confirm they were still alive. Fort Worth in the days before Christmas of 1974 carried a familiar warmth. The store windows glowed with seasonal displays, car radios hummed with holiday music, and families moved through their routines with a sense of quiet certainty. Nothing in the air suggested danger. This was a city where people believed daylight offered protection, where public places felt inherently safe, and where ordinary plans were rarely questioned. The Seminary South Shopping Center embodied the confidence of its time. It was crowded, brightly illuminated, and alive with pre-holiday urgency. Shoppers moved from store to store in a gentle rhythm, arms filled with wrapped boxes and paper bags. Children tugged at their parents' hands, teenagers gathered in careless groups, and sales clerks worked beneath strings of festive lights that softened every corner of the space. In an environment like this, danger felt not just unlikely, but inappropriate, as though fear itself had no permission to exist there. That collective sense of safety matters more than it seems. It shaped behavior, awareness, and attention. Number 1 studied the exits. No one fixed unfamiliar faces in memory. The idea that a crowded mall could quietly consume three people without resistance simply did not register. This calm was not accidental, it was cultural. In 1974, shopping malls symbolized stability and social order. They were designed to feel controlled, communal, and predictable. The places where nothing truly bad was supposed to happen. Among the shoppers that afternoon was 17-year-old Rachel Trilliker, a girl who had stepped into adulthood earlier than most. According to family accounts and contemporary reporting, Rachel had married young and was already living the life of a wife, not a high school student. She was described by those who knew her as calm, dependable, and serious beyond her years, while many teenagers were still exploring who they might become. Rachel was already expected to be stable, measured, and responsible. That kind of early maturity often comes with quiet pressure, the kind that is carried internally and rarely discussed out loud. Walking beside her was her younger sister, 14-year-old Renee Wilson. Renee was at a transitional age, no longer a child, but not yet grounded in adulthood. Friends and relatives remembered her as lively and affectionate, someone who enjoyed movement, conversation, and small adventures. Christmas shopping was exciting to her, not because of obligation, but because it felt grown-up and festive. Renee trusted her older sister completely, following her decisions without hesitation, assuming that safety was guaranteed simply because Rachel was there. The youngest of the three was 9-year-old Julie Mosley, a close family friend and neighbor. Julie was still firmly rooted in childhood. She was described as cheerful, talkative, and eager to be included with the older girls. At her age, awareness of risk had no place in her thinking. Julie depended entirely on the protection of those around her, especially Rachel. In that crowded mall, surrounded by adults and lights and noise, all three believed without question that nothing could happen to them. What united the three of them was the assumption that this afternoon carried no risk. They were not sneaking out. They were not hiding anything. They told their families where they were going and when they would return. There was no packed bag, no hidden cash, no sign of preparation for anything beyond a short trip to the mall. And back home, Rachel's life, however, carried weight that the others did not share. Marriage at 17 came with expectations that pressed heavily on her shoulders. Responsibility can mature a person quickly, but it can also isolate them. Rachel was expected to be reliable, composed, and strong, even when she might have wanted space to breathe or the freedom to step back into youth. Renee and Julie did not share that burden. Their concerns were small and immediate, centered on gifts, food, and the excitement of the season. They trusted the world because the world had not yet given them reason not to. In that sense, Rachel was not just their companion, but their protector. Whether she consciously embraced that role or not, waiting at home were families who saw nothing unusual in this outing. Tom Brown, Rachel's husband, expected her to return. As planned, the families of Renee and Julie assumed the girls were safe under Rachel's supervision. There were no accusations, no tension, only the quiet reliance that comes with ordinary relationships and routine trust. Even in ordinary lives, emotional distance can exist without being visible. Responsibility can create silence. Expectations can prevent people from speaking openly about stress or doubt. None of this implies guilt or intent, but it matters when examining how easily assumptions can mask inner conflict or unspoken strain. The broader environment also played a role. The United States in the 1970s had few surveillance systems and limited public awareness around missing children. Cameras were rare, and the idea that someone could vanish in plain sight had not yet entered the collective imagination. People believed danger announced itself loudly, not quietly. This belief shaped how communities responded to uncertainty. If no violence was seen and no noise was heard, many assumed nothing was wrong. Public safety was equated with visibility, not vigilance. In that context, the absence of alarm felt like reassurance, even when it should have prompted concern. Fort Worth that day was not a city anticipating loss or danger. It moved through December with routine confidence, guided by habit rather than caution. Streets were busy, stores were full, and life followed its expected rhythm. That is what makes the disappearance of Rachel Chlicka, Renee Wilson, and Julie Mosley so profoundly disturbing. The sense of safety was not shattered by violence or chaos. It eroded quietly, unnoticed in the moment, collapsing beneath them without a single alarm or warning to signal what was coming. The afternoon of December 23, 1974, began without urgency. It was the kind of day shaped by routine and expectation rather than surprise. Rachel Chlicka left home with her sister Renee and Renee's friend Julie. After clearly explaining their plan, they were going to the Seminary South Shopping Center, a familiar place, to spend a few hours shopping before Christmas. There was nothing secretive about the trip, nothing that suggested finality. They did not pack bags or bring extra clothing. They did not withdraw unusual amounts of money or take personal items that hinted at departure. Everything about their behavior suggested intention to return. In the psychology of disappearance, this detail matters. People who plan to leave rarely do so without preparation. What the girls carried that day reflected only a short, ordinary outing. The timing of the trip placed it squarely within daylight hours. Early afternoon, when traffic was steady and the mall was active. Parents trusted these hours because visibility was high and danger seemed distant. The idea that 3 girls could vanish during such a window felt incompatible with common sense. That belief would later slow understanding of what had occurred. Witnesses would later confirm. Seeing the girls inside the Seminary South Shopping Center, they were observed browsing stores, moving casually, behaving exactly as expected. There were no reports of arguments, no visible distress, and no sign that anyone was following them closely. The absence of disturbance would become one of the case's most haunting features. There was no recorded confrontation, no security report of a struggle, no memory of raised voices or hurried movement. In a crowded public space, violence usually announces itself. Here nothing did. This silence complicates every theory, because it suggests either extraordinary control or a sequence of events that unfolded without resistance. As the afternoon passed, time continued its normal rhythm for everyone else. Shoppers came and went. Employees closed registers and prepared to go home. The mall did not lock down, because there was no reason to. Whatever happened to the girls did not interrupt the flow of the day. At home, waiting turned into concern. When evening approached, and the girls had not returned, families began to feel the quiet pressure of uncertainty. At first, there was rationalization. Maybe they stayed longer than planned. Maybe traffic delayed them. These explanations are common psychological defenses against fear. As night fell, and the girls still had not arrived, worry replaced patience. Calls were made. Routes were retraced. Eventually, the families contacted police. By then, hours had passed. Time, which could have been an ally, had already slipped away. The discovery that followed deepened the unease. Rachel's car was found still parked at the shopping center. It had not been moved. It was not damaged. It sat exactly where it had been left. as if waiting for its owner to return. This detail alone contradicted many early assumptions. Inside the vehicle were personal items. Purses were still there. Purchases made earlier that day remained untouched. These objects spoke silently of interruption rather than choice. People planning to disappear rarely abandoned money and belongings. The car suggested a pause that was never resolved. What disturbed investigators just as much was what failed to appear. There were no marks of urgency, no scattered belongings, no physical signs of resistance near the car. The vehicle showed no damage, no disturbance, nothing to suggest panic or coercion. It was as if the girls had simply stepped away and dissolved into the afternoon. The parking lot, expected to provide clarity, offered only emptiness, leaving behind a silence that felt deliberate and deeply unsettling. From a behavioral perspective, this moment becomes critical. If the girls had left voluntarily, the evidence suggests they did so calmly. If they were taken, it occurred without visible resistance. Either scenario challenges instinctive expectations about fear and survival. Days later, a new element entered the story. A letter arrived, postmarked after the disappearance. It was addressed to Rachel's husband, Tom Brown. The handwriting appeared to be Rachel's, and the tone was oddly restrained. It stated simply that they were going to be gone for a while and asked him not to look for them. The letter did not sound panicked. It did not explain where they were going or why. It offered reassurance without clarity. This contradiction unsettled investigators and family members alike. Language, especially under stress, carries emotional markers. This letter contained remarkably few. Experts debated its authenticity. Some believed the handwriting matched Rachel's. Others noted subtle inconsistencies. Handwriting analysis is not exact science, and disagreement among specialists only deepened the mystery. If Rachel wrote the letter, the question became why. If she did not, the question became who did. Psychologically, the letter functions as a fracture point in the case. It introduces doubt where certainty was already fragile. It complicates the narrative of victimhood without providing agency. It neither confirms escape nor proves coercion. It exists in an uncomfortable space between. The phrase "we're going to be gone for a while" carries weight because of its vagueness. It suggests duration without destination, intention without explanation. It denies closure while discouraging pursuit. Whether written freely or under pressure, it served to delay action and blur urgency. From this point forward, the case shifted. What had begun as a straightforward missing persons investigation became layered with uncertainty. Every interpretation created new contradictions. Every answer opened another question. The shopping trip that began as an ordinary errand had quietly transformed into something else entirely, not through noise or violence, but through absence and ambiguity. What happened inside that space between arrival and disappearance would define the case forever, not by what was seen, but by what could never be confirmed. In the first hours after the girls were reported missing, the investigation did not accelerate with the urgency that modern audiences might expect. Law enforcement approached the situation through a framework that was common in the 1970s. Teenagers, particularly young women who were married or close to adulthood, were often assumed to have left of their own accord. This mindset shaped the earliest decisions, quietly steering the case away from immediate crisis response. At that time, missing persons cases were frequently filtered through social expectations rather than behavioral evidence. Rachel's age and marital status mattered more to investigators than the presence of two minors. The prevailing assumption was simple and deeply consequential. Perhaps this was a voluntary disappearance. That belief, once formed, influenced everything that followed, from resource allocation to investigative tone. Because of that assumption, the first 48 hours passed without decisive action. There was no immediate lockdown of the Seminary South shopping center, no comprehensive sweep of nearby roads or surrounding neighborhoods. Witnesses who might have recalled small but crucial details were not urgently canvassed while memories were still sharp. In missing persons cases, this window is critical. Time does not merely pass, it degrades clarity. According to later reviews of the case, evidence that would eventually feel alarming was initially treated as inconclusive. The abandoned car remained parked where it had been left. Personal belongings were untouched inside. Christmas gifts were still inside the vehicle. Two of the missing were children, yet none of this was considered sufficient to override the runaway narrative. During those early hours, In the cultural context of the 1970s, the absence of visible violence often translated into the absence of perceived crime. Without blood, broken glass, or eyewitness accounts, danger was assumed to be unlikely. This belief ignored a growing reality that criminologists would later acknowledge. Many crimes, especially those involving manipulation or coercion, leave little physical trace. At the outset, as police hesitated, the story began to move beyond official channels and into the public domain. Local newspapers picked up the disappearance quickly, publishing photographs of the girls and summarizing what little was known. Headlines asked questions without answers. Each article repeated the same limited facts, slowly transforming uncertainty into speculation. Media coverage brought attention, but it also introduced distortion. Details were reinterpreted, emphasized, or quietly altered as they moved from one report to another. The letter mentioning that the girls would be gone for a while became a focal point in print. Often framed without context or caution, its presence invited assumption. Even before its authenticity was examined, public reaction was swift and emotionally charged. Communities attempted to fill the informational vacuum with their own theories. Some believed the girls had chosen to leave, imagining teenage rebellion or a desire for escape. Others suspected a tragic accident that had not yet been uncovered. Still others feared abduction, envisioning an unknown predator exploiting a moment of trust. These competing narratives did not exist independently. They collided in conversations, in print, and in the minds of investigators. Rumors traveled faster than verified information. Each explanation carried emotional weight, and none offered relief. For the families, this uncertainty was not theoretical. It was lived, moment by moment, under constant strain. As attention grew, so did scrutiny. The families of Rachel, Renee, and Julie found themselves examined almost as closely as the evidence. Their statements were analyzed. Their behavior was interpreted. Every pause in speech, every emotional response, every perceived inconsistency became material for judgment. Grief, when made public, is rarely allowed to be private or imperfect. Pressure intensified as days turned into weeks. Law enforcement began revisiting earlier assumptions, but momentum had already been lost. Witnesses who might have noticed something unusual now struggled to recall specifics. Faces blurred together. Timelines became uncertain. The mall, once crowded with potential observers, turned into a sea of indistinct memories. Inevitably, investigative focus shifted toward those closest to the girls. This pattern is well documented in criminal psychology. When answers are scarce, suspicion moves inward before it moves outward. Familiar figures feel more accessible than unknown threats. In this case, Rachel's young husband, Tom Brown, became a central figure of attention. Tom Brown was questioned multiple times. His movements were reconstructed. His reactions were evaluated against expectations of how grief should look. Some observers perceived emotional distance. Others interpreted his demeanor as shock or numbness. Psychological research consistently shows that trauma produces varied responses, but public opinion often demands a single, recognizable script. Other acquaintances and peripheral figures were also considered. Friends, neighbors, casual contacts, and people who might have crossed paths with the girls that afternoon were questioned. Each lead was examined and eventually set aside. No account produced physical evidence or a credible confession. Each possibility dissolved under scrutiny, leaving behind unanswered questions. But the center of the investigation was a single letter, initially seen as an explanation, but soon becoming a source of division. Handwriting experts compared it to known samples of Rachel's writing, yet no consensus emerged. Some believed it was authentic, while others noted inconsistencies, suggesting stress or external influence. This uncertainty weakened the case. If genuine, the letter implied choice. If coerced or forged, it implied control. Its calm, distant tone raised troubling psychological questions about intent, leaving investigators with interpretation instead of certainty. As debate over the letter deepened, the investigation fractured. Competing theories divided resources and attention, preventing sustained focus. Momentum faded as time passed. New cases emerged, and leads cooled. The disappearance of the Fort Worth Three was not defined by a single failure, but by accumulated hesitation. Early assumptions delayed action, and delay weakened evidence. The search did not collapse at once. It slowly eroded under cultural bias and human uncertainty. What remained was not resolution, but a silence shaped by many missed moments, still echoing decades later. On the surface, nothing about their lives suggested danger. There were no criminal records, no history of rebellion, no clear warning signs recorded before the day they vanished. Yet in cases that stretch across decades, the most critical truths are often not found in what is visible, but in what remains carefully hidden beneath ordinary routines. Rachel Trilliker was only 17 years old, yet she was already married. In the mid-1970s, early marriage was not unusual, especially in working-class American communities. But normal did not mean easy. Marriage came with expectations, emotional stability, responsibility, sacrifice that even many adults struggle to carry. For someone still navigating adolescence, those pressures could weigh quietly and constantly. Those who knew Rachel described her as mature, dependable, and serious beyond her years. She was the type of person others relied on. But maturity at such a young age can also be a survival skill rather than a choice. Growing up quickly often means learning to suppress uncertainty, fear, or dissatisfaction. It means appearing strong even when you are not. There is no documented evidence that Rachel planned to leave her life behind. No packed bags, no money set aside, no conversations overheard about running away or starting over. Yet the absence of evidence does not automatically mean the absence of inner conflict. Stress does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it settles into silence. Psychologists often note that young people placed into adult roles too early may experience a quiet fracture between who they are expected to be and who they feel themselves to be. That fracture does not always lead to action, but it can create vulnerability. And vulnerability, in the wrong moment, can be exploited. Renee Wilson, Rachel's 14-year-old sister, existed in a very different psychological space. Still a teenager, still deeply dependent on older figures for safety and decision-making, Renee followed Rachel not out of obligation, but trust. To her, the shopping trip was simple and harmless, a chance to spend time together, a chance to feel grown up, without being alone. Julie Mosley, only 9 years old, represented something even more fragile. She had no agency in the choices of that day. She went where she was told, trusted the people she knew, and likely viewed the outing as an adventure. Her presence complicates every theory that suggests voluntary disappearance. Children that young do not vanish by choice. They are taken, or they are led. This is where the narrative fractures. If Rachel had intended to disappear, why bring two younger girls with hers, especially one who was not even family? Why choose a crowded shopping center at the height of the Christmas season? Why leave behind money, belongings, and transportation? Nothing about the logistics supports a planned escape. And yet, the letter exists. We're going to be gone for a while. Those words continue to haunt the case because they sit uncomfortably between two realities. On one side, they suggest intention. On the other, they raise the possibility of coercion. Handwriting experts could not agree on whether the letter was written freely or under pressure. Language analysts pointed out that the phrasing felt oddly detached, lacking emotion or explanation. If the message was voluntary, it was strangely incomplete. No destination, no reassurance, no reason. If it was forced, then it becomes something far darker, a performance meant to delay concern. Hidden pressures are not always personal. They can be environmental. America in the 1970s was a different psychological landscape. Public trust was higher. The idea that children could be abducted from a busy shopping mall in broad daylight was almost unthinkable. Parents believed that public spaces were inherently safe. Predators relied on that belief. There were no surveillance cameras to retrace movements, no digital footprints, no instant alerts. Once the girls stepped out of sight, they entered a void where memory became unreliable and time worked against the truth. Investigators later explored whether someone might have approached Rachel with authority posing as security, law enforcement, or a store employee, a calm voice, a plausible reason, a request that didn't feel dangerous until it was too late. In such a scenario, Rachel's sense of responsibility may have worked against her. She might have complied to protect the younger girls, believing cooperation was the safest option. That theory does not require panic. It requires trust. And trust, once misplaced, leaves no evidence behind. The most unsettling possibility is not that Rachel wanted to escape, but that she was trying to manage a situation she believed she could control, a conversation that went wrong, a moment of hesitation, a decision made under pressure, with incomplete information. If Rachel believed she was acting to protect Renee and Julie, compliance may have felt like the only option available. She may have followed instructions carefully, not out of choice, but out of calculation. Writing the letter could have been framed as a small, harmless act meant to delay pursuit or prevent panic. In moments of psychological pressure, obedience can feel like control. It can create the illusion that cooperation buys safety, or at least time. But whatever promise may have been implied, safety never followed. The act that was meant to shield them instead became a permanent question mark, frozen in ink. Decades later, the case remains defined by what never appeared. No confirmed sightings, no verified remains, no confessions that survive scrutiny. Only fragments remain, scattered across psychology, circumstance, and memory. 3 girls vanished, and with them went certainty. The case did not grow cold because it lacked emotion, but because every theory collided with a single, unsettling truth. Whatever happened unfolded quietly. There was no visible struggle, no public violence, no interruption anyone noticed. The danger did not announce itself. It arrived calmly, blended in, and once it took hold, none of them ever came back. When a case offers no bodies, no crime scene, and no definitive timeline of violence, investigators are left with something far more fragile than evidence: interpretation. Over the decades, the disappearance of the Fort Worth 3 has generated multiple theories, each attempting to explain how 3 girls could vanish from a crowded shopping center without leaving behind a single, reliable trace. None of these theories fully answers every question, but each one reveals something about human behavior, opportunity, fear, and silence. Theory, a personal motive from someone close. One of the earliest and most persistent theories centers on the idea that the disappearance involved someone the girls already knew. In many missing person cases, familiarity creates opportunity. Someone close would have known their plans, their routines, and the assumption that they would be safe. The strength of this theory lies in access. A person within their social or family circle could approach without raising alarm. Trust lowers defenses. Compliance feels natural. If someone asked Rachel to step aside, to help with something, or to follow them briefly, she may not have hesitated, especially if she believed it was for the benefit of the younger girls. There is also the unsettling reality that crimes committed by known individuals are often cleaner in appearance. There is less struggle, less chaos, fewer witnesses. Silence can be manufactured more easily when emotional bonds already exist. However, this theory collapses under the weight of missing proof. No physical evidence ever tied a specific individual to the disappearance. No credible confession emerged, despite decades of scrutiny. Suspicion alone cannot sustain a conclusion, especially when every person of interest was eventually cleared or left floating in ambiguity. Knowing someone creates opportunity, but it does not automatically create motive, and in this case, motive remains frustratingly undefined. Theory B, accident turned into a cover-up. Panther hypothesis suggests that the disappearance began not as a crime, but as a tragic accident, possibly involving a vehicle. The shopping center was busy, especially in the days leading up to Christmas. Traffic was heavy, parking lots were crowded. Chaos was normal. In this scenario, an accidental collision could have caused panic. Fear of legal consequences might have driven someone to hide what happened, escalating a single moment of negligence into a long-term mystery. Panic does not breed rational decisions, it breeds desperate ones. The strength of this theory lies in human psychology. People do irrational things when they believe their lives are about to collapse. Cover-ups often begin with small lies that grow larger with time, but this explanation faces nearly impossible obstacles. There were no signs of an accident, no blood, no damaged vehicles reported, no witnesses describing a disturbance. More critically, concealing the fate of 3 individuals, 2 of them children, would require extraordinary planning, resources, and silence. Accidents leave traces. Even the most careless cover-ups eventually fracture. In this case, nothing surfaced. The absence of chaos argues strongly against an accidental origin. Theory C, stranger abduction. Perhaps the most chilling and widely accepted possibility is that the girls were taken by a stranger. The 1970s saw a rise in opportunistic abductions across the United States. Public awareness was low. Security infrastructure was minimal. Predators exploited trust in public spaces. A shopping mall during the holidays offers anonymity. Crowds provide cover. Movement goes unnoticed. A confident offender can blend into the noise, especially if the interaction appears calm. The strength of this theory lies in historical context. Many abductions during that era involved deception rather than force offers of help, authority, impersonation, or manipulation. If someone presented themselves as security or an employee, Rachel may have complied, believing she was protecting Renee and Julie. This theory also explains the total lack of personal motive. A stranger would leave no emotional trail, no obvious connection to investigate. Once the opportunity passed, the trail would vanish with them. Yet this explanation raises its own questions. Stranger abductions often leave witnesses someone noticing discomfort, hesitation, or fear. In this case, no one recalled seeing the girls distressed. No one reported a struggle. No one heard raised voices. The disappearance appears too smooth, too quiet even for a practiced predator. Theory D. Someone unexpected from their circle. This final theory occupies the most uncomfortable space. It suggests that the person responsible was not a close family member, nor a complete stranger, but someone loosely connected, a neighbor, an acquaintance, someone familiar enough to be trusted, but distant enough to avoid deep scrutiny. The strength of this theory lies in invisibility. Such individuals rarely attract suspicion. Their interactions feel harmless. Their presence does not stand out. They can manipulate without triggering alarm, especially in young victims. Psychologically, this type of offender often relies on social engineering rather than force, calm persuasion, authority by proximity, a sense of obligation or politeness that discourages resistance. However, this theory suffers from a lack of investigative depth. In the 1970s, background checks were limited. Databases did not exist. Many potential leads were never fully explored. Time erased names, memories, and possibilities. If someone like this was responsible, they may have moved through life without ever attracting real suspicion. Each theory offers a partial explanation, illuminating one edge of the puzzle while leaving the center untouched. There were no credible sightings, no remains recovered, no confessions that endured scrutiny. 5 decades passed without the emergence of a single piece of evidence capable of breaking the case open. That kind of silence is not neutral. It speaks. Such silence points to control, not chaos. It suggests intention rather than impulse, cooperation instead of resistance. The question is not which theory is most dramatic, but which explains total absence. How can 3 people vanish so completely that history itself loses them? And if the truth still exists, who has carried it through decades of quiet? Disappearance is often mistaken for inaction, when it is actually the result of precise psychological control. Such crimes rarely rely on visible violence. They succeed by guiding behavior rather than overpowering the body. Trust becomes the most effective weapon, silencing internal alarms before resistance can form. Psychologically, offenders understand that fear does not always provoke defiance. It often creates compliance. Calm authority and confident direction can be more powerful than threats, especially in public spaces where the mind defaults to normalcy and avoids confrontation. This effect intensifies in spaces designed to feel safe. Shopping centers, schools, churches, and hospitals carry an unspoken promise of protection, encouraging people to lower their guard. Danger is expected to announce itself, not arrive quietly. That assumption creates a psychological blind spot, where subtle manipulation can move unnoticed even in public view. Young victims are especially vulnerable. Their sense of risk is still forming, while social conditioning rewards obedience and politeness. When instinct clashes with expectation, discomfort is suppressed. Silence becomes practiced, not accidental. In the case of the Fort Worth 3, this dynamic cannot be ignored. If the girls were guided rather than forced, their lack of resistance becomes tragically understandable. A trusted presence, or even a convincingly calm stranger, could have reframed the situation as temporary, harmless, or necessary. Psychological captivity does not require locked doors or restraints. It requires belief. Once belief is secured, control follows naturally. This is where philosophy begins to intersect with criminal psychology. From a Buddhist perspective, Suffering arises from attachment and illusion. One of the most persistent illusions is the belief that escape leads to relief. Running from pressure, responsibility, or fear does not dissolve suffering. It often transforms it into something heavier and more enduring. If any part of this disappearance involved the idea of escape, it would not represent freedom, but a deeper entanglement with pain. Buddhism also emphasizes impermanence and the danger of mistaking surface calm for inner peace. A situation can appear quiet while remaining profoundly unstable. Silence does not mean resolution. It often means postponement. In this light, disappearance becomes a postponement of suffering rather than its end, a pause that stretches across time without ever resolving its cause. Western philosophy frames the issue through a different lens, focusing on autonomy and responsibility. Adolescence occupies a fragile space between dependence and independence. It is a period defined by conflicting demands, the desire to choose freely and the weight of obligations imposed by family, society, or circumstance. When that tension becomes unbearable, the idea of disappearing can feel like reclaiming control, even when it is not. Existential thinkers have long warned that freedom without grounding leads to anxiety rather than liberation. Choice alone does not guarantee meaning. Without responsibility, freedom becomes disorientation. If the disappearance involved any belief in starting over, it would reflect not empowerment, but confusion. The absence of structure does not create peace, it creates vulnerability. Christian theology adds yet another dimension, centered on guilt, sacrifice, and silence. Within some moral frameworks, enduring suffering quietly is seen as virtuous. Silence becomes both shield and sentence. Bearing pain without protest can feel like atonement, a way to restore balance when words or actions seem insufficient. If someone carried responsibility for what happened, silence may have felt like the last remaining form of control. Silence, in this sense, is not emptiness, it is containment. It holds guilt, fear, and unresolved meaning in place. Over time, silence can feel safer than truth, especially when truth threatens identity, family, or so. This does not excuse wrongdoing, but it helps explain how it persists. These philosophical perspectives do not accuse, they illuminate. Human behavior is rarely driven by a single motive. Fear, duty, hope, guilt, and self-preservation often coexist, shaping decisions that only make sense in hindsight. The disappearance of 3 girls may reflect not one failure, but multiple overlapping ones across victims, offenders, and institutions. From an investigative standpoint, psychology explains the stall. Early assumptions framed the narrative before evidence could intervene. When the case was seen as voluntary, urgency faded, resources stalled, witnesses went unchallenged, and silence was allowed to solidify into permanence. Today, silence does not hold the same authority it once did. Modern investigative psychology recognizes patterns that were previously dismissed. Witnesses who were never re-interviewed may now recall details differently, filtered through maturity rather than shock. Subtle inconsistencies once ignored may finally be understood within a broader behavioral context. The technology also reshapes what is possible. DNA databases, forensic genealogy, and familial matching have solved cases far older than this one. Objects once considered meaningless can now carry answers. Even partial remains, if ever recovered, could speak more clearly than any confession. Science does not guarantee truth, but it reduces the space in which silence can hide. Comparative analysis offers a disciplined way forward. When cases sharing behavioral signatures are examined together, patterns begin to surface. The absence of struggle, the lack of witnesses, the controlled environment. These details often recur in crimes shaped by psychological control rather than force. Patterns do not establish guilt, but they narrow the field of possibility. They replace speculation with structure, allowing investigators to move beyond isolated facts and toward behavioral logic. In this way, comparison does not solve a case outright, but it sharpens the questions being asked. Yet even when philosophy, psychology, and technology converge, one barrier remains unchanged: time. Time erodes memory, weakens accountability, and softens consequence. Those involved may no longer be alive, and those who know may believe the truth no longer matters. Silence grows easier with years, but silence is not absence, it is compression. Truth does not disappear, It waits in fragments, in overlooked details, in the unease left behind when a story has no ending. 3 girls, one ordinary shopping trip, and a void that was never filled. The Fort Ware 3 is more than a missing persons case. It reflects what was overlooked: time lost, urgency delayed, and voices unheard. In a mall built on routine and trust, nothing seemed broken, no alarms sounded, and yet everything quietly changed. Some crimes leave no blood or chaos. They leave silence, silence that stretches across decades, carried by families and unanswered questions. This case reminds us that danger does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it blends in, speaks calmly, and vanishes without resistance or witnesses. Remembering Rachel Licker, Renee Wilson, and Julie Mosley is not just about solving a case. It is about refusing to let absinthe become forgetfulness. If these stories matter to you, please like, share, and subscribe so their names are not lost to silence. Again, some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mind.